The courthouse porch baked in the afternoon sun, a stage for a cruel kind of theater, and Judge Pritchard was the star of the show. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight, his voice slicked with an oily humor that made good men look at their boots. "Pick any wife for free, boy," he drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "No one here will stop you." The crowd chuckled right on cue, a tired, practiced sound. Their eyes darted from the judge to the women lined up on the steps, each one a portrait of quiet desperation. They were farm girls and widows, cleaned up just enough to be presentable. Their hair was brushed, their dresses patched, their faces scrubbed of hope. They were commodities in a game they never asked to play. But then there was the one at the very end. She wasn't like the others. She didn't belong in any marriage market, not even one this grim. Her ankles were bound in rust-bitten iron chains. Her dress was a gray rag clinging to a frame so thin you could count the ribs. Her hair was a matted curtain of black, hiding her face from the world. She was pressed against a porch post as if trying to merge with the wood, to disappear completely. The crowd didn't look at her. The other women didn't look at her. It was like she was already a ghost. No one looked at her, except for the cowboy. He'd been standing at the edge of the street, silent and still, his hat tipped low against the sun. He watched the whole pathetic spectacle without a flicker of emotion, a statue carved from dust and patience. Then he moved. His boots sent lazy puffs of dirt into the air as he walked, each step deliberate, measured. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of the judge's chair, blocking his view of the sun. His voice, when it came, was flat and even, but it cut through the thick, hot air like a razor. Her. The laughter died so fast, it was like someone had sucked all the air out of the town square. A man coughed. Someone else muttered, a low hiss of disbelief. He's gone mad. Judge Pritchard's eyebrows climbed his forehead in mock surprise. He squinted, pretending to notice the chained girl for the first time. "That one?" he boomed, playing to his audience. "Boy, she's not fit to keep a dog company, let alone a man." The cowboy didn't even blink. His eyes were fixed on the girl, and his voice was a low rumble that tolerated no argument. "Her," he said again. This time the girl's head tilted. Just a fraction, but it was enough for him to see the dark bruise blooming along her cheekbone, the thin, crusted line of blood at her lip, and behind all that pain, a pair of eyes met his. They weren't pleading, they weren't broken, they were testing him, daring him. The judge leaned forward, his friendly mask slipping. He studied the cowboy like a card player trying to read a tell, trying to find the bluff. He found nothing. With a sharp, annoyed wave of his hand, he barked at his deputies. "Fine. She's yours to ruin. Unlock her and get this over with." Two burly men lumbered toward the girl. One fumbled with a ring of keys, the other gripped her arm, his knuckles white. She flinched, a small, barely perceptible movement. But the cowboy moved faster. Before they could drag her, he stepped between them, plucking the key from the deputy's belt himself. He knelt down, his back to the jeering crowd, and unlocked the heavy iron chains. They clanged against the wooden steps as they fell, leaving angry red grooves in her raw skin. She didn't thank him. She didn't even look at him. She just shifted her bare feet on the splintered boards, stood a little straighter, and waited. "Let's go," the cowboy said, standing and holding out a hand. She stared at it. For a long, silent moment, she just stared at his calloused palm, as if weighing a choice that had no right answer, as if trying to decide if taking it would save her, or damn her for good. Then slowly, she slid her small, trembling fingers into his. The crowd parted for them with a restless, angry murmur. As they stepped down into the dusty street, the judge's voice followed them, oily and certain, a final curse laid upon their heads. "You'll wish you'd pick different, boy," he shouted. "That girl's not just trouble. She's got a mouth that'll hang a man." The words lodged in the cowboy's mind like a burr under a saddle. He glanced down at the silent girl whose hand he held, wondering what secrets she kept behind those guarded eyes, and whose noose she might be holding in her silence. The moment they stepped off that courthouse porch, the entire town became a loaded gun pointed at their backs. The sun beat down, the dust swirled, but the real heat came from the eyes, hundreds of them following their every move. The girl's bare feet stumbled in the thick dust, the raw skin on her ankles pulling tight with every pained step. But she never leaned on him. She walked with a stiff, defiant pride that seemed to infuriate the onlookers even more. Whispers followed them like dry leaves skittering in the wind. She's the one. You know what they say she did? He won't last the week. Mark my words. A woman in a crisp blue bonnet saw them coming and physically clutched her son's shoulder, yanking him back as if the girl carried a plague. The boy stared, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The cowboy, Kane, didn't slow his pace. His grip on her hand was steady, but he could feel a fine tremor running through her fingers. It wasn't the shaking of fear. It was something else, the vibration of a tightly wound spring, ready to snap. They reached his bay mare tied to a hitching post at the end of the street. As he moved to lift her into the saddle, a sharp voice cut through the whispers like a whip crack. Kane. He turned. Sheriff Doran was leaning against the opposite rail, his arms crossed over his chest. The tin star pinned there caught the light, not like a symbol of justice, but like a warning. "You sure you know what you're taking home?" the sheriff asked, his voice low and gravelly. Kane's jaw tightened. "I know enough." The sheriff's gaze slid past him, landing on the girl. She froze, her hand hovering over the saddle horn. "Enough to get you hanged, maybe," Doran sneered. His mouth twisted into something that was almost a smile, but it held no warmth. It was a dare. "Tell him, girl. Go on, tell him what you saw that day." Her lips pressed into a thin, white line. A tiny muscle flickered in her jaw, a single betrayer of the storm raging inside her. But she said nothing. The sheriff took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots crunching in the dirt. He was enjoying this. "She won't, Kane, because she knows the second you hear it, you'll throw her right back where you found her. Judge Pritchard gave her a choice, you see. Those chains, or a pine box. And believe me, the box was him being generous." Kane moved without thinking, stepping between the sheriff and the girl. He made his body a wall, a shield. "You done?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The sheriff's eyes narrowed into slits. "You want to play the hero? Fine. That's your business. But don't you dare bring her back into my town when this all blows up in your face." Without another word, Kane swung into the saddle behind her, his arm bracing her small frame as he took the reins. As they started down the main street, away from the glares and the whispers, the girl finally spoke. Her voice was so low it was almost swallowed by the clatter of hooves. "You shouldn't have chosen me." He glanced down at her profile, thin, bruised, her eyes fixed on the empty road ahead as if she could see their future written in the dust. "Too late for that," he said simply. She gave a single, sharp shake of her head. "Not too late for them to come after you." Kane didn't ask who they were. He didn't have to. He could hear the answer in her tone, a grim certainty that sent a chill down his spine despite the blistering heat. Whatever she had seen, whatever secret she was hiding, it wasn't just dangerous. It was still out there, watching, waiting. And he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that back on that courthouse porch, Judge Pritchard was leaning forward in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face, like a man who'd just lit a very long fuse. They hadn't ridden more than a mile out of town when the world went silent. The normal buzz of insects, the cry of a distant hawk, it all just stopped. Kane felt it first, a prickling on the back of his neck. He scanned the tree line to his right and saw it, a flicker of movement, a shadow where no shadow should be. The girl felt it too. Her body went rigid against his. She didn't turn her head, but her gaze cut sharply to the side. The road ahead was narrowing, funneling them between two low, rocky ridges. It was a perfect trap. A place where you could be herded like cattle and not even realize it until the gate slammed shut behind you. Kane slowly reined the mare to a walk. The horse sensed it, too. Her ears swiveled, her muscles bunching beneath the saddle, ready to bolt. And that's when a figure stepped out onto the road ahead of them. He was a big man, wearing a long duster despite the heat. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He held a rifle in his hands, held it loosely, casually, but it was pointed right at Kane's chest. "You're a hard one to catch, Kane," the man drawled. His voice was a rasp of old whiskey and even older grudges. Then came the sound, the thud of hoofbeats on the packed earth behind them. A second rider, cutting off their retreat. Kane didn't bother to turn around. He just watched the girl's fingers clamp down on the saddle horn, her knuckles turning white. The man in the duster up ahead glanced at her, and his lips peeled back in a grin that held no humor. "Judge sends his regards," he said. "Says the lady belongs back where you found her." Kane's reply was as even and cold as Riverstone. "Tell the judge he can come say that to me himself." The second rider was closer now. Kane could hear the creak of his saddle leather, the heavy snort of his horse. The trap was closing. "That ain't how this works, Kane," the second man called out from behind. "She saw something she shouldn't have, and the judge aims to keep it that way." Suddenly, the girl's voice cut through the tension, sharp and surprising. It was the first time she'd spoken above a whisper. "If you kill him here, everyone will know why." For a single frozen heartbeat, nobody moved. The man in the duster's empty grin faltered. His eyes flickered, a flicker of calculation, of reassessing the situation. "Then we'll just have to make it look like an accident," he snarled. Kane's hand drifted down, his fingers brushing the worn handle of the revolver at his hip. His other arm tightened protectively around the girl's waist. The mare shifted under them, a bundle of coiled energy ready to explode. "You thinking of drawing on me, Kane?" the man asked, the barrel of his rifle angling up just a fraction. "No," Kane said, his eyes locked on the girl's. He saw the understanding in them, the trust. "I'm thinking we're not staying for this conversation." And with a sudden, powerful kick, he spurred the mare hard to the left. Not towards the open road, not back the way they came. He spurred her straight into the dense scrub and low brush of the ridge. The rifle cracked. The bullet whined past Kane's ear, so close he felt the heat of it. The mare lunged into a full gallop, dirt and stones exploding from under her hooves. Behind them, shouts erupted. The pounding of pursuit was so close Kane could feel the vibration through the ground. The girl twisted in the saddle to look back, her black hair whipping into Kane's face like a storm. "They won't stop!" she cried, her voice a mix of warning and confession. "Not until I'm dead!" She paused, her eyes wild, and her next words hit him like a physical blow. "Or until the judge is." Kane didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just urged the mare on, deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. The truth of his choice back on that porch was now painfully, terrifyingly clear. This wasn't a rescue. It was a declaration of war. A war you either won completely or you didn't live to walk away from. They rode until the mare's flanks were slick with lather and her breath came in ragged bursts. The shouts of their pursuers had long since faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Kane finally guided the horse into a narrow gully, a hidden scar in the earth shielded by a chaotic spill of massive rocks. It was a place he'd used before, a place to let the world forget you existed for a while. The air here was cooler, shaded by ancient cottonwoods, and a thin ribbon of water trickled over smooth stones. He swung down from the saddle, his boots landing in the soft, damp dirt. Then he reached up and lifted her down. The moment her bare feet touched the ground, she swayed, her legs threatening to give out. She caught herself on the mare's shoulder, then quickly stepped back, as if ashamed of the moment of weakness. Cain led the horse to the stream, letting her drink. He watched the girl from the corner of his eye. She was staring at the water, her expression unreadable, as if she couldn't decide whether to drink from it or drown herself in it. "You want to tell me what that was about back there?" he finally asked. His voice was low, but it had an edge of steel. She shook her head once, a short, sharp movement. "No." He let the word hang in the quiet air between them. "No," he repeated, not as a question, but as a challenge. A quiet demand for the truth he had just risked his life for. She knelt by the stream, cupping the cool water in her hands. She let it run over her bruised wrists, watching the dirt swirl away before she spoke. "You think picking me in front of the judge was some act of charity?" Her voice was bitter. "It wasn't. It was a challenge. You've put yourself in his sights now, and once you're there—" She trailed off, her gaze lost in the shimmering water, as if the rest of the sentence was too terrible to speak aloud. Cain moved closer, crouching down beside her. His shadow fell over her hands. "You saw something," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact laid bare. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked up to meet his. "Something worth killing me over," she confirmed, her voice flat. She looked back at the riders they'd left behind, a new, chilling understanding dawning in her eyes. "And worth killing you over too, now." The words settled between them, heavier than any stone. For the first time since he'd taken her hand on that porch, Cain felt the true, crushing weight of what he had stepped into. This wasn't just about a corrupt judge. This was something far darker. "Then why hasn't he already done it?" Cain asked, his mind racing. "Why the show on the porch?" A humorless half-smile touched her lips, a grim, fleeting thing. "Because he needs people to believe he's untouchable. He needs to make a spectacle of his power. Shooting me in a dark alley is messy. Selling me off like cattle, that's a performance. It sends a message to everyone else to stay in line." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her ragged dress. For a moment, the way she held her shoulders, she looked less like a prisoner and more like a soldier. "But now," she continued, her voice hardening, "now that you've interfered, he can't afford the performance anymore. When he realizes he can spin your death another way, he'll send someone who doesn't miss twice." Cain rose with her, his eyes instinctively scanning the high ridgeline that bordered the gully. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Was she telling him everything? "Then we don't give him the chance," he said, his voice firm. She studied him for a long, silent beat, testing him again, trying to see if the words were real or just something men like him said to feel brave. Then, almost reluctantly, as if the words were being pulled from her, she spoke. "My name," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "It isn't what they call me. The nameless girl. The trouble." Cain waited, his silence giving her the space she needed. She took a breath that seemed to scrape against her ribs. "It's Mara." No last name, no explanation, just that one, small offering. It was the first thing she had given him freely, a single piece of herself reclaimed from the wreckage. He nodded once, accepting it. "Mara, then. We'll move at night." Her eyes suddenly flicked past him, towards the mouth of the gully. Cain followed her glance, and just for a second, high up on the distant ridge, he saw it. A tiny, brilliant glint of sunlight flashing off metal. Whoever it was, they weren't moving fast. They were patient. They were watching. Mara's voice was flat, devoid of all emotion, a statement of terrifying fact. "They've already found us." Cain didn't waste a single second looking twice. The glint on the ridge was gone as quickly as it had appeared, vanishing like a snake into tall grass. But the chilling certainty it left behind was as real as the gun on his hip. He grabbed the mare's reins and thrust them into Mara's hands. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a low command. "No matter what happens." She didn't argue. She didn't hesitate. She just fell into step behind him as he led them deeper into the gully, moving toward a sharp bend where the rock walls rose higher, offering more cover, a place to break a rifleman's line of sight. The sound came first, a single pebble skittering down the steep slope to their left. Then the metallic click, a sound every man in the west knew and dreaded, the sound of a rifle's lever being drawn. Kane spun, his revolver already in his hand, just as two men dropped into the gully from opposite sides, landing in plumes of dust. They were fast. They were professionals. And they both wore the same black kerchief tied around their necks. Kane had seen that kerchief before, on the men who rode with Judge Pritchard's private army. One of them grinned, a predator's smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Judge says the lady's overdue for her rope." The other man's eyes never left Mara. He looked at her with a chilling detachment, as if she were already dead. Kane felt her press closer behind him, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. "Funny," Kane said, keeping his revolver low but ready. "I don't recall the judge owning the law outside his own porch." The first man's grin widened. "He owns everything worth owning in this county, including the stories folks tell. You and her vanish on this trail. They'll call it a lover's quarrel gone bad. They'll forget your names by sundown." Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. He was out of options, out of time. But before he could make his move, Mara's voice cut through the air. It wasn't trembling. It wasn't frightened. It was as steady and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, and it froze all four of them in place. "If you kill him," she said, her voice ringing off the canyon walls, "you'll be doing the judge a favor." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Because I'm the only one who saw him shoot Marshal Weaver in the back." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the heat, thicker than the dust. It was the sound of a world tilting on its axis. The two henchmen glanced at each other, and in that one fleeting look, Kane saw it all. The shock, the confusion, the dawning, sickening realization. They hadn't known. The judge had sent them to kill a witness, but he'd never told them what she witnessed. The second man's rifle lowered by a single crucial inch. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "That's a big claim, girl," he stammered. Mara stepped out from behind Kane's protection. Her dress was torn, her feet were bare, her face was bruised, but in that moment, she was the most formidable person in the gully. There was nothing fragile in her stare. "It's not a claim," she said, her voice laced with ice. "It's the reason he chained me up and tried to sell me like cattle. He was burying his secret in plain sight." She took another step toward them, her eyes boring into theirs. "You take me back to him now. You'll be standing in the same room when he decides you've heard too much too." The first man's grin was completely gone now. His gaze darted up toward the ridge, as if he expected the judge himself to appear and strike them all down for their hesitation. That single heartbeat of doubt was all Kane needed. His revolver came up, the barrel swinging between the two men. "You have one chance," he said, his voice a low growl. "Walk away, and pretend you never found us." The second man didn't need to be told twice. He started backing away, muttering under his breath. But the first man, the one with the predator's smile, tightened his grip on his rifle. Orders are orders. Kane didn't aim to kill. He aimed to persuade. He fired 2 shots, so fast they sounded like one. The bullets slammed into the dirt inches from the man's boots, kicking up sprays of rock and dust. The mare reared, snorting in panic, and Mara grabbed the saddle horn to steady herself. The echo of the gunshots was still bouncing off the gully walls as the two men scrambled back up the ridge, their retreat punctuated by curses thrown over their shoulders. Kane holstered his revolver, his heart pounding. He turned to Mara. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the weight of her revelation. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice rough. "About the marshal?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time there was no test in them. No walls, no defenses, just a grim, unshakable certainty. "I watched him fall," she said softly, "and I watched the judge smile while he did it." Kane felt the weight of her words settle deep into his bones, heavier and colder than any iron chain. He finally understood. This wasn't just about saving her anymore. This was about surviving long enough to bring down a man who believed he was a king, a man who thought he was untouchable. And that, Kane knew with a chilling finality, was the kind of fight that didn't end until one side was buried in the ground. They followed the gully until it spat them out into open country. The land rolled away in low, gentle swells of dry grass and scattered mesquite trees, beautiful and treacherous. Kane kept them off the main trail, choosing a less traveled wagon road that wound south. He knew of a settlement 2 days' ride away, a place big enough to get lost in, a place to swap the horse, buy supplies, and maybe, just maybe, disappear into the shuffle of strangers heading west. But as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of blood and orange, they crested a ridge and saw it. The settlement, sprawled in the basin below. Its handful of buildings cast long, skeletal shadows across the dusty main street. At first glance, it seemed peaceful. Then Kane realized it was too peaceful, too quiet. He slowed the mare, his eyes scanning the street, every muscle in his body tensing. And then he saw it. Nailed to the post outside the livery stable, a fresh sheet of paper fluttering in the evening breeze. Even from this distance, he recognized the bold black print of an official notice. Wanted. And beneath it, a rough, charcoal sketch of a man's face. His own. Mara stiffened against him, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes were locked on that piece of paper, as if she could read the damning words from 100 yards away. "He's faster than I thought," she murmured, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. Kane didn't respond. He just guided the mare down the long slope, each step careful and measured. His gaze never left that poster. As they reached the edge of town, the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was predatory. People in doorways, who had been talking quietly, fell silent. They looked up as Kane and Mara passed, some with idle curiosity, others with a sharp, calculating glance that measured the weight of the Colt revolver on his hip and the exhaustion in their faces. At the town well, an old man stopped drawing water mid-pull. His eyes flicked from Kane to Mara, then back to the damning paper on the post. The message was clear. The judge's poison had arrived before they had. Kane dismounted, taking the mare's reins in one hand. His other hand rested casually, deliberately, near the handle of his gun. He walked straight to the post and tore the poster down without ceremony. He folded it once and tucked it into his vest, an act of defiance that felt small and useless. "We won't stay long," he said to Mara, his voice a low whisper. They started toward the mercantile, needing food and water, but their path was suddenly blocked. 2 men stepped off the boardwalk, planting themselves in the middle of the street. They both wore cheap tin badges pinned to their vests. Not real lawmen. Hired security. Hired guns. "Kane Roar," the taller one said, not even bothering to hide the smug smirk on his face. "Judge Pritchard's been looking for you." Mara shifted slightly behind him. Kane felt the movement, the tiny vibration of tension that radiated from her. She was getting ready. "You can tell him I'm not looking for him," Kane replied, his voice calm, trying to angle past them. But the second man, shorter and thicker, stepped to the side, blocking their way again. The heel of his boot made a loud, deliberate thud on the packed earth. "See, that's the problem," he said, his eyes glinting with greed. "He's put a price on the girl, too. A big one." He paused for effect, letting the words hang in the heavy air. Dead or alive. The noise of the town seemed to fade away, The world narrowed to the space between them, the setting sun and the promise of violence. Mara's fingers brushed the back of Kane's arm. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't a gesture of fear. It was a signal, a silent question. "Are you ready?" Kane's eyes narrowed. "Then you'd better hope you can collect," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "before someone else does." The taller man's smirk faltered, just for a second. But it was enough. Kane pushed past him, pulling the mare along. The horse's hooves struck the hard-packed street with a sharp, warning crack. The two men watched them go, their hands twitching near their guns. But they didn't move. They were weighing the reward against the risk. Kane and Mara didn't stop until they reached the far edge of town, the last rays of sunlight dying at their backs. The air behind them was thick with an unspoken truth. Judge Pritchard hadn't just put a price on their heads. He had turned the entire territory into a net. Every road, every town, every stranger was now a potential threat, and every single path now led to someone who would sell them out for the right amount of coin. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of blood and gold, Kane glanced at Mara. "We can't go south anymore." She met his gaze, her face a pale oval in the twilight. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard fire. "Then we go where he can't send his men," she said. Kane nodded, turning the mare north into the growing darkness. But he knew, deep in his gut, that a place like that might not exist. And if it did, they'd have to find it before the judge's shadow swallowed them whole. They rode north under a blanket of stars, the cool night air a welcome relief. The prairie was a vast, dark ocean, and they were adrift in it. Hours later, a new scent carried on the wind. Wood smoke. Kane followed it, his instincts on high alert. The smell led them to a low cluster of cabins tucked against a dense stand of cottonwoods. It was the kind of place too small to have a name on any map, too remote to draw the attention of men like Judge Pritchard. A single lantern glowed in the window of the largest cabin. As they approached, the door creaked open, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was thin, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a faded dress and an apron dusted with flour, but the set of her shoulders was not that of a simple homesteader. It was the posture of someone who had seen trouble before and had faced it down. "You're a long way from any trail," she said, her voice neutral. Her gaze flicked from Kane to Mara, then to the exhausted mare. "We need a night's shelter," Kane replied, keeping his own tone steady and unthreatening. "We can pay." The woman studied them for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeming to peel back the layers of their lies and desperation. Then, with a curt nod, she gestured toward a small barn. "Water the horse. There's stew on the stove. You can eat." Inside, the cabin was a fortress of warmth and safety. It smelled of sage and baking bread, and the soft lamplight cast gentle shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Mara slid onto a bench near the hearth, her shoulders slumping for the first time since Kane had met her. He accepted a bowl of thick, savory stew from the woman, who introduced herself as Ruth. She didn't ask questions. Not about where they'd come from, or where they were going. And Kane was careful not to offer any information. The quiet comfort of the small cabin was almost disarming. It was the kind of peace that could make a man forget he had a price on his head, that a judge was tightening a noose around the entire territory. Mara ate in silence, but her eyes were never still. She tracked every move Ruth made, noting the way the woman glanced out the dark window more than once, as if expecting someone. When Ruth set a second bowl of stew in front of her, she spoke softly. "You've come far, haven't you?" Mara hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Farther than I wanted." Ruth's gaze lingered on the dark bruise along Mara's cheekbone, and a strange, unreadable emotion passed across her face. "Well," she said, her voice softening, "you can rest here tonight. No one will find you here." Kane felt a knot of tension in his shoulders finally begin to ease. Maybe they had found it. a safe harbor in the storm. But later, after the fire had burned down to glowing embers and Mara had fallen into an exhausted sleep on the bench, Kane saw Ruth slip outside. She drew a thick shawl around her shoulders, a dark silhouette against the moonlit yard. Something was wrong. Kane followed her, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He stopped in the deep shadow of the porch, just out of sight. And that's when he heard her voice. It was low, urgent, a conspiratorial whisper carried on the cool night air. "They're here," she was saying to someone, or something in the darkness. "The man and the girl, yes, both of them." Ice flooded Kane's veins. He stepped back inside the cabin without a sound, his mind instantly racing, calculating angles, exits, the fastest way out. Moments later, Ruth returned. Her expression was calm, almost kind, as she quietly closed the door. She slid the heavy wooden bolt into place, the sound echoing in the small room like a coffin being nailed shut. She didn't see him standing in the shadows by the hearth until he spoke. "How far out are they?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and fear, for just a fraction of a second before her mask of composure slammed back into place. "Half an hour," she clipped, her voice sharp. "Maybe less. I sent word. The judge. He promised no trouble would come to my home if I cooperated." "If you handed us over," Kane finished for her, his voice flat and dead. Mara stirred at the sound of his voice, blinking the sleep from her eyes. She saw the look on his face, saw Ruth standing by the bolted door, and she understood instantly. The safety they had found had just become another cage. Ruth's voice rose, laced with a desperate defensiveness. "Pritchard's men don't leave loose ends. If I hadn't sent for them, they would have burned this place to the ground with me in it." Kane took a slow step toward her, the faint lamplight catching the cold fire in his eyes. "Then you'd better pray we're long gone before they get here," he growled, "or this cabin won't be your protection. It'll be your grave." He didn't wait for a reply. He just jerked his head toward Mara. "Up. Now." As Mara scrambled to her feet, a new sound began to weave its way into the night. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder. The distant, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves. A drumbeat counting down the final seconds of their escape. They slipped out the back door of Ruth's cabin and into the dark, tangled maze of the cottonwood grove. Kane kept a firm hand on the mare's muzzle, leading her by the reins to muffle the sound of her steps. The hoofbeats on the road grew louder, a steady, predatory rhythm that seemed to pound inside Kane's own skull. The moon was high, its light filtering through the dense canopy of leaves, painting Mara's face in shifting patterns of silver and shadow. In that fractured light, she looked less like a fugitive and more like a warrior, her face set in grim determination. They found what Kane was looking for, a dry creek bed that snaked away from the road, its banks high enough to shield them from view. He swung into the saddle and pulled Mara up in front of him. He urged the mare eastward, away from the approaching riders, keeping to the low ground, the soft sand of the creek bed swallowing the sound of their escape. They rode in silence until the thunder of their pursuers faded into nothing more than the whisper of the wind. Only then did Kane slow the mare to a walk, the horse's breath coming in harsh, loud gasps in the cool night air. "Now," he said, his voice low but sharp with command. "No more secrets. No more half-truths. I want it all. What did you see?" Mara didn't look at him at first. Her eyes were fixed on the pale, sandy ribbon of the creek bed, stretching out before them in the moonlight. "It was 3 weeks ago," she began, her voice brittle, as if the words themselves were sharp and painful. Marshal Weaver had been called to the courthouse after dark. Judge Pritchard told everyone there was trouble in the records room, a possible break-in. She paused, swallowing hard. "I was cleaning in the main hall. I heard them arguing. Weaver was accusing the judge of fixing land deeds, of stealing property from widows and small ranchers who couldn't pay the new taxes he'd invented. Her hands tightened on the saddle horn, her knuckles white in the moonlight. Pritchard didn't even deny it. He just laughed. He told the marshal he couldn't prove a thing without the official ledgers. And then he pulled a pistol from his desk drawer and shot Weaver in the back, right before he could even reach the door. The words tumbled out of her now, a torrent that had been dammed up for too long. He looked up and saw me. I was standing in the doorway. I ran, but he had men waiting outside. They dragged me to the jail cell. He told me I'd be the one to hang for the marshal's murder unless I kept my mouth shut. Then he changed his mind. He decided to sell me instead. Said it was a cleaner way to make someone vanish. No body, no grave for anyone to ask questions about. Kane listened, his face a mask of stone, the horrific picture taking shape in his mind, each detail another knot tightening in a hangman's noose. "The ledgers," he said, his voice rough. "The proof." She hesitated, then finally turned in the saddle to meet his gaze, her eyes blazing with a desperate fire. "I know where they are," she whispered. After I heard him tell his clerk to hide them, in a false wall, right behind the judge's bench in the courtroom." The impact of her words hit Kane like a physical blow. The proof, the evidence that could burn Pritchard's entire empire to the ground. And it was sitting in the very heart of his power, a viper hidden in the viper's nest. "Why?" Kane asked, his voice strained. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Her eyes hardened, the vulnerability of a moment ago gone, replaced by a shield of bitter experience. "Because every man I could have told was either on Pritchard's payroll or in his pocket. Because everyone I've ever trusted ended up dead or bought off. I needed to know if you were different." He held her stare, the vast, silent darkness of the prairie pressing in around them. For a long moment, the only sound was the mare's tired breathing and the whisper of the wind over stone. "You know what this means, don't you?" he said finally, the gravity of their situation settling over him. "If we go after those ledgers, there's no more running. There's no riding out of this quietly. It means walking straight back into that town, into that courthouse, with every gun he owns pointed right at us." Mara's jaw set, her expression filled with a resolve that mirrored his own. A resolve forged in pain and injustice. "Then we make sure we don't miss," she said. Somewhere far to the west, a lone coyote called out, its cry thin and sharp against the vast, dark silence. And Kane felt the weight of a new choice settle between them. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about justice, a fight that would only end with one man's name carved into a tombstone. The eastern sky was just beginning to blush with the first pale light of dawn when they reached the next township. It was larger than the others, a bustling hub of activity even at this early hour. Kane kept to the alleyways, the mare's hooves clopping softly on the packed earth, their progress cloaked in shadow. But even in the half-light, he could feel the change. The air here was different. It was thick with suspicion. Conversations on porches would stop mid-sentence as they passed. Curtains in windows would twitch, and faces would turn just enough to catch a glimpse before disappearing again. The news of their escape, of the bounty, had traveled faster than they had. They stopped outside a blacksmith's shop to water the mare at a trough, and that's when Kane saw it. It was nailed to the post right beside the smithy's door. Another broadside, the ink so fresh it still shone wetly in the morning light. The letters were bigger this time, bolder. Wanted. Kane Roar. $500. Dead or alive. But it was the notice below his that made his blood run cold. Wanted. Mara. No surname. $750 alive. $300 dead. The paper didn't bother to hide the reason. It spelled it out in cruel, stark print for the entire world to see. For the murder of Marshal Weaver and theft of court property. Kane's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He ripped the sheet down, crumpling it in his fist. But it was too late. Across the street, two men in dusty coats had already seen it. They'd seen him see it. Their heads were bent together now, their conversation quick, low, and greedy. Mara stepped closer, her voice a strained whisper. "He's raised the price." Kane shoved the crumpled poster into his saddlebag, his mind racing. "It means he's running scared." "Or," she countered, her eyes scanning the street, "it means he knows he can't keep this quiet much longer. He needs me silenced. Permanently." The sharp, rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil rang out from inside the smithy. The loud noise masked the sound of boots scuffing on the wooden boardwalk just behind them. Kane didn't turn. He didn't have to. He could feel the weight of their eyes on his back. When the hammer fell silent, he slowly turned. 3 men stood there. They were tall and lean, with the hard, sun-scorched faces of men who made their living with a gun. Their hands were loose at their sides, but they were inches away from the revolvers holstered on their hips. "Morning, Roar," the one in the middle said. His voice was casual, almost friendly, as if they were just passing the time of day. "That bounty looks mighty generous, especially for a couple of saddle-worn travelers like yourselves." Kane straightened slowly, deliberately placing his body between Mara and the 3 men. "Trouble is," he said, his own voice dangerously calm, "you'd have to get us back to Pritchard alive to collect the full price, and I don't reckon he pays for damaged goods with the same smile." The man grinned, flashing teeth that were too white and even for this dusty street. "Oh, alive is more fun anyway," he chuckled. He took a single step off the boardwalk, the other 2 fanning out beside him. They were closing the circle. Kane saw the flicker in Mara's eyes, the quick, desperate calculation of angles, of distances, the way a trapped animal learns to measure every escape route in a single glance. "Back alley," Kane murmured, his lips barely moving. Mara understood. Her hand slid silently to the mare's reins, her fingers tightening. The lead bounty hunter's grin widened. "Going somewhere?" Kane didn't answer with words. The mare shifted, a planned distraction, and in that single frozen beat of time, Kane's hand blurred into motion, his draw a flash of sun on steel. The crack of the first shot was deafening. It echoed down the street, splintering the wooden post right where the bounty notice had been. Chaos erupted. Someone shouted. A door slammed shut. A woman screamed from an upstairs window. Kane fired again, the bullet kicking up dirt at the feet of one of the men, sending him stumbling back into a stack of barrels. He pivoted, grabbing Mara's arm and pulling her with him as they bolted for the narrow alley between the smithy and the next building. The mare, spooked but loyal, followed right at their heels, her hooves striking sparks off the cobblestones. Behind them, boots pounded on the ground. A gun fired, the bullet ricocheting off the brick wall with a high-pitched whine. The smell of gunpowder was thick in the morning air. They burst out of the far end of the alley and onto the open prairie. Kane vaulted into the saddle, pulling Mara up behind him, and spurred the mare into a dead run. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He didn't stop until the township was just a hazy smear on the horizon, a bad memory already starting to fade. Mara twisted in the saddle to look back at the empty landscape. "You see now, don't you?" she said, her voice strained over the pounding of the horse's hooves. "It's not just his men anymore. It's not just the law. It's everyone. Everyone with a gun and a taste for coin." Kane didn't reply. But deep in his gut, a cold dread was spreading. She was right. Judge Pritchard had turned the entire territory into a hunting ground, and they were the prey. Every step they took, every town they passed, every face they saw was now a gamble against time, against bullets, and against the crushing weight of a price that could turn even a good man into a killer. They rode for hours, the prairie a shimmering, endless blur of gold and green under the relentless midday sun. Kane pushed the mare hard, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and the last town. But the feeling of being watched never left him. Then he saw it, a thin column of dust rising against the clear blue sky far ahead. Instinct took over. He veered the mare toward a shallow ravine, hoping to use the terrain to hide their passage. But the dust cloud was moving too fast, and it was splitting, fanning out into multiple trails. Riders, at least 6 of them, and they were closing in from 2 different directions, a classic pincer movement, a trap. Mara twisted in the saddle, her eyes narrowed as she counted them. "Pritchard's men," she said, her voice low and certain. "They have better horses. They've been tracking us." Kane scanned the ground ahead. The ravine they were heading for curved sharply and ended in a sheer rock wall, a box canyon. If they rode into it, they'd be penned in like cattle for the slaughter. He swung the mare sharply to the left, trying to break for open ground. Too late. A rifle cracked from the high ridge to their right. The shot was perfect, kicking up a spray of dirt right in front of the mare's hooves, forcing her to a skittering halt. Another rider appeared from the south, a black silhouette against the sun, cutting off their last escape route. They were boxed in. The noose had been drawn tight. "Kane," Mara said, her voice dangerously calm, her fingers gripping his arm with surprising strength. "If they take us alive, we won't even make it to the courthouse. He won't make that mistake again." He knew she was right. One of the riders on the ridge stood up, bold and confident. His voice carried easily in the still, hot air. "Drop the gun and step away from the girl, Roar. The judge wants her breathing. He didn't say anything about you." Kane's gaze swept the canyon rim. He counted the rifles. He calculated the distances, the angle of the sun. The odds weren't just bad. They were a death sentence. "We can't outshoot them," Mara murmured, her voice a breath against his ear. "Then we outthink them," he growled back. He slid down from the saddle, keeping the bulk of the mare between them and the nearest rifleman. Mara started to follow, but he pressed the reins firmly into her hands. "When I give the word," he said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes locked on hers, "you ride. Ride for that narrow gap in the eastern wall. Ride hard and don't you dare look back. You understand?" Her eyes searched his face, reading the truth he was trying to hide, reading the lie. "What about you?" she whispered. "I'll be right behind you," he lied again. Then he stepped out from behind the mare, his revolver held low at his side, in plain sight. He raised his voice, pitching it so every man on the ridge could hear him. "You boys ever try hunting something that hunts back?" he called out, his voice laced with a defiant mockery that infuriated them. The lead rider on the ridge frowned, thrown off balance by the strange question. The bravado. It wasn't the reaction of a cornered man. That single moment of confusion was all Kane needed. He roared the word. "Now!" Mara didn't hesitate. She slammed her heels into the mare's flanks. The horse, sensing the life-or-death urgency, bolted like a bolt of lightning. She surged toward the narrow gap in the canyon's eastern wall, a streak of brown muscle and flying dust. Rifle fire erupted from all sides. Bullets whined off the rocks around her, kicking up stone chips that flew like shrapnel. But the mare's explosive speed made her an impossible target. As Mara rode, Kane didn't run. He charged. He fired twice toward the main group on the ridge, not aiming to hit, but to force them to take cover. As they ducked, he sprinted after Mara, his boots slipping and sliding on the loose shale, the sound of gunfire chasing him like a pack of angry wolves. He heard Mara scream his name, her voice a desperate, terrified cry that was cut short as she and the horse vanished through the gap in the rock. The crack of a rifle behind him was deafeningly close. He felt a violent tug on his head. The bullet tore through the brim of his hat, the force of it yanking the hat from his head and sending it spinning into the dust. He dove, launching himself through the gap just as another bullet slammed into the rock where his head had been a second before. He landed hard, rolling in the dust, and came up running. The mare was waiting. Mara had wheeled her around, her face a mask of terror and relief. Kane didn't slow. He vaulted into the saddle behind her. and they were gone. They rode until the ground dropped away into a wide, dry riverbed that swallowed them whole, the towering walls hiding them from view, the sound of their pursuers finally fading into the silence of the empty land. For a long moment, the only sound was the pounding of their own hearts and the ragged, desperate rasp of the mare's breathing. They had survived. But as the adrenaline faded, a cold, harsh reality set in. They were out of options, out of time, and out of places to run. The sun began to set, casting the riverbed in long, deep shadows. They were exhausted. The mare was spent, and they had no food, no water, and nowhere to go. This was it, the lowest point. Kane dismounted, his movements stiff and slow. He checked the mare's legs, his hands gentle as he ran them over her trembling muscles. Mara slid down beside him, her silence a heavy weight between them. She noticed the dark stain spreading on the sleeve of his left arm, a long gash torn open by a ricocheting rock chip during their escape from the canyon. Without a word, she tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her already ragged dress. She dipped it in the last of the water from their canteen and began to clean the wound. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her movements efficient. They didn't speak. In the quiet of the dying day, words felt useless. He watched her face, illuminated by the soft twilight. The bruise on her cheek was starting to fade, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. It wasn't the wild fire of fear anymore. It was the steady, hot glow of pure resolve. "He was expecting us at that canyon," she said finally, her voice low. "He knew which way we were running. That woman, Ruth. She must have told them more than just where we were. She must have told them where you said you were going." Kane nodded grimly. "The South Road. He knew he could box us in. They were trapped in a game where their opponent was always 2 steps ahead. Every move they made was anticipated. Every path they chose led to another ambush." Then Mara looked up from his arm, her eyes locking onto his. A new light was dawning in them. A dangerous, desperate idea. "If he knows where we're going," she said slowly, "it's because we're always running away. We're doing what he expects." Kane watched her, seeing the thought form, seeing the impossible logic of it. "What if we stop running?" she whispered, the words hanging in the air like a prayer. "What if we do the one thing he would never expect?" She took a deep breath, the strip of cloth held tight in her hand. "There's one more thing I never told you," she said. "About the ledgers. Marshal Weaver knew something was wrong. He'd been investigating the judge for months. The night he died, he told me he'd found a way to get into the courthouse unseen. An old cellar entrance, hidden beneath the boardwalk behind the building. It was sealed up years ago, but he said the lock was rusted through. Hope. It was a dangerous, fragile thing, but it flickered to life in the darkness of the riverbed. A plan. A real plan. Not just running, not just surviving, but fighting back. He can't predict a move we don't even know we're going to make, Kane said, the idea taking root in his own mind. They looked at each other, the unspoken decision passing between them. It was insane. It was suicide. But it was the only move they had left. Kane took the reins of the tired mare. He tested his wounded arm, the pain a sharp, grounding reminder of what was at stake. He looked back the way they had come, back towards the town, the courthouse, the heart of all their troubles. Then, under the first pale stars of the evening, he turned the horse around. They were no longer running from the fire. They were walking right back into it. Getting back into town was the easy part. Under the cloak of a moonless night, they were just 2 more shadows in a world full of them. They left the mare hidden in a thicket on the outskirts and slipped through the back alleys, moving like ghosts. The hard part was the courthouse. It loomed at the end of the main street, a dark, hulking beast, its windows like vacant eyes watching over the sleeping town. They found the cellar entrance exactly where Mara had said it would be, hidden beneath the raised boardwalk behind the building. a heavy, slanted wooden door covered in years of dirt and grime. As Mara had said, the old iron lock was a rusted wreck. With a sharp kick from Kane's boot, it shattered, the sound unnervingly loud in the dead quiet. The air that wafted up from the darkness below was stale and cold, smelling of damp earth and forgotten things. "Ready?" Kane whispered. Mara nodded, her face a pale oval in the darkness. She was terrified, but she didn't waver. They descended the creaking wooden steps into the pitch-black cellar. Kane struck a match, the tiny flame pushing back the oppressive darkness, revealing stone walls and a floor littered with old barrels and broken furniture. They moved slowly, carefully, every creak of a floorboard above their heads making them freeze. They found the stairs leading up into the main building and emerged into a narrow hallway. The courthouse was silent, a tomb of polished wood and paper. They crept toward the main courtroom, their footsteps echoing like thunder in their own ears. The courtroom doors were unlocked. They slipped inside. The huge, cavernous room was even darker than the hallway, the tall windows letting in only the faintest starlight. The judge's bench stood at the far end of the room like a dark altar. "Behind the bench," Mara whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "A false wall." He kept the ledgers there. They moved toward it, Kane lighting another precious match. He ran his hands along the wood paneling behind the judge's ornate chair. He found it, a section of the wall that felt hollow. There was a seam, almost invisible in the dark, but there was no handle, no latch, no visible way to open it. "How?" Kane murmured, frustration mounting. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway just outside the courtroom doors. They froze, every muscle tensed. Kane instantly extinguished the match, plunging them back into absolute darkness. They held their breath, listening. The soft, rhythmic tread of boots, a night watchman, a deputy doing his rounds. The footsteps grew closer, closer, and then stopped, right outside the door. Kane's hand went to his revolver. He could feel Mara pressed against the wall beside him, not daring to breathe. The silence stretched for an eternity. The doorknob began to turn. Then, from the far end of the street, a shout rang out, followed by the sound of breaking glass. A drunken brawl, a welcome distraction. The footsteps outside the door hesitated, then moved away, heading toward the commotion. They waited, hearts pounding, until the footsteps faded completely. "That was too close," Kane breathed. He lit another match and returned to the wall. He examined the paneling again, his fingers searching for any hidden mechanism. He found it. A small, decorative carving of a snake eating its own tail. He pressed it. Nothing happened. He tried to turn it. With a soft, grinding click, the entire section of paneling swung inward, revealing a dark, cavernous space. And inside, sitting on a dusty shelf, was a stack of thick, leather-bound books, the ledgers. They had done it. Kane reached in, his fingers brushing against the dusty leather. He grabbed the heavy books, a wave of triumph and relief washing over him. And that's when the entire courtroom was flooded with light. Lamps flared to life all around them, held by at least a dozen men who had been waiting in silence. They were surrounded. And standing in the center of the room, a smug, victorious smile spreading across his face, was Judge Pritchard. "I must admit, Roar," the judge said, his voice booming in the suddenly bright room, "I didn't think you were foolish enough to come back, but I'm so very glad you did." He gestured to the ledgers in Kane's hands. "Go on, open them. I'm eager to see the look on your face." It was a trap. The whole thing had been a trap. Kane's heart sank like a stone. He opened the top ledger. The pages were blank, every single one. He dropped it and opened another, also blank. They were dummies. Judge Pritchard let out a great, bellowing laugh. "You didn't really think I'd leave the proof of my life's work sitting in a wall, did you? I knew she'd remember this place. I was counting on it. I've had men watching this courthouse every single night, just waiting for you to walk into my parlor." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. He looked at Mara, his smile turning into a vicious sneer. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, girl. But it ends tonight. The story is already written. 2 wanted fugitives, breaking into the courthouse to plant false evidence against a respected judge, are killed while resisting arrest. Tragic, but clean." He nodded to his men. Rifles were raised, hammers were cocked. There was no escape. "This is the end of the line," the judge declared. But before his men could fire, the main doors of the courtroom swung open with a deafening bang. Sheriff Doran stood in the doorway, and he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a crowd of armed townsfolk, weather-beaten ranchers, grim-faced widows, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, the very people whose lives and lands Pritchard had stolen. Their faces were a mixture of fear and cold, hard rage. Pritchard's jaw dropped. "Doran! What is the meaning of this? Arrest these people!" The sheriff took a slow step into the room, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. He looked not at Pritchard, but at Kane and Mara. "Marshal Weaver was my friend," he said, his voice low and full of a grief that had hardened into purpose. "He knew he couldn't trust me, knew the judge had me in his pocket, but right before he died, he gave me a key, told me if anything happened to him I should use it." Pritchard's face went pale. "Your men were so busy watching the back door," the sheriff continued, a grim smile touching his lips. "They never thought to watch the marshal's office." He held up a single, leather-bound book, a real one. "The real ledgers," he said. "Weaver made copies of everything." The judge's men looked at each other, their confidence shattering. The armed townsfolk began to file into the courtroom, their numbers swelling, their eyes fixed on Pritchard with a hatred that was decades in the making. "This is mob justice," Pritchard screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "It won't stand!" That's when Mara stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper of a victim, but the clear, ringing voice of a survivor. It cut through the tension, and everyone, on both sides, fell silent to listen. "I saw you," she said, her eyes locked on the judge. "I saw you murder Marshal Weaver. I saw you laugh. And I will stand in any court, and I will tell them what I saw." It was over. The henchmen, seeing the tide turn, seeing the money and power vanish before their eyes, began to lower their rifles. They were hired guns, not martyrs. A desperate, cornered look came over the judge's face. He lunged, not for a gun, but for Mara. If he could take her hostage, he might still have a chance. But Kane was faster. He moved like a striking snake, shoving Mara behind him and slamming the butt of his pistol into the side of the judge's head. Pritchard crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence fell over the courtroom. The long, bloody reign of Judge Pritchard was finally over. In the days that followed, the town began to heal. The real ledgers exposed the full depth of the judge's corruption, and land was returned to its rightful owners. Justice, slow and hard-won, had finally come. Kane and Mara stood on the courthouse porch, the same porch where they had first met. But this time, the air was different. It was clean. It was free. The town offered them a reward, a home, a chance to settle down. But they both knew that wasn't their path. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They were partners now, forged in fire and bound by something stronger than chains. Without a word, they walked down the steps, retrieved their mare, and rode out of town, not toward any specific destination, but simply toward the open horizon. They weren't running anymore. They were just riding, together. Their story became a legend in that small corner of the West, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, the courage of 2 people can be enough to bring an empire of corruption crumbling to the ground. If you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one.